Bonsoir. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Welcome back to Art Speaks. We are so thrilled to welcome you to another talk after a year away from the stage. Lillian and I are thrilled to welcome all of you here, and we're happy to hear all the positive buzz in the room. And we're so excited to introduce our guests as well. But before we begin, I'm going to take a moment to express gratitude for and acknowledge the lands and waters on which we are gathered tonight. Art Speaks is located on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. It is known as Tiohtià:ke in Kanien'kehá:ka and Muniyang in Anishinaabemowin. It is historically a gathering place for many First Nations, and today is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationship with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Before Lillian comes on stage and introduces our stellar guest, I want to remind everyone that now would be the perfect moment to turn off your devices and put them on silent mode. Following the talk, there will be a 20-minute question period, and you'll see that on the aisles there's stands that you could come see me and my colleague at. We just ask that you keep your questions short and sweet so that a maximum amount of people get to engage with our speakers. And one last thing, since you're all here, we thought it would be a good idea to let you know that our next talk is actually next month. And we will be sending out an announcement with the details next week. But since you're here, I'll reveal that our next talk will be with curator and writer Helen Molesworth. And she'll be in conversation with writer and curator Jared Ernest. And it's going to be on May 11th at the Cinéma du Musée. So just make sure to sign up for our mailing list, artspeaks.ca, for all the details. And without further ado, I'm going to give the stage to Lillian, who's going to introduce tonight's guests. Thank you.
Bonsoir à tous et toutes. Je suis tellement contente de te revoir at Art Speaks. Mojane and I work hard to bring innovative and thoughtful thinkers to Montreal, and tonight I'm thrilled to introduce you to three extremely accomplished people. David Zwirner, who will moderate tonight's conversation, is a graduate of Yale College in literature and philosophy. At Zwirner Gallery, he oversees all aspects of publishing, overseeing the release of 25-plus books each year. He initiated the successful podcast Dialogues, and in 2021, he started Platform, an online art exchange. If that isn't enough, he also writes and translates literature from German and French, most recently for a book by Elias Canetti. Very amazing man. Tal Lewis, who we're proud to say is Canadian, is a maker of bewitching sculptural installations that include large-scale fabric figures and masks. Tao transforms found textiles and artifacts through painstaking processes of sewing and quilting into imaginary talismans and magical beings. At a young age, he achieved international success, exhibiting around the world, and this past year, Tao showed prominently in the Venice Biennale. Woody Othello, who lives and works in San Francisco, has a large practice that spans sculpture, painting, and printmaking. His large-scale, colorful sculptures of distorted everyday objects infused with human emotion, humor, and references to history. To quote Woody, "What if the telephone held the anxiety we feel when answering calls? And what if the stools we sat on exuded our tiredness?" I thought that was wonderful to listen to. Like Tao, Woody found early success. He is in the collections of museums around the country, and last year had an important piece in the Whitney Biennale. There's a lot of brilliant talent on the stage tonight, so please welcome Lucas, Tao, and Woody.
First of all, Lillian, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's very nice to be here. So nice to be here with Tao and Woody, and thank you all for coming out to see us. I know we're all honored to be here. I thought by way of an introduction, it would be nice to hear a little bit from Tao and Woody about their practices. I know many of you are familiar with their work. Nonetheless, it's a rare opportunity to hear from an artist how they see what they do in the different ways that they see these things. And so I thought that maybe we'd start by passing it over to Tao to tell us a little bit, in whatever way she wants to, about her work and practice.
It's kind of not a little bit. It's kind of a lot. Hi, everyone. I'm the token Canadian on the panel today. Okay, so I have maybe like 10 minutes of words to say to you. And also, thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you, Mojane. Thank you, Lucas and Woody, also, for being here. And to all of you as well. This has been a really nice opportunity for me to ruminate on some of the things that I've done right and done well in a moment where I've been very self-critical. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to stick to my notes so that I don't ramble. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of my ideas, and there will be some images that I've tried to sort of tailor around some of my regional Canadian exhibitions or things that I made in Canada or about Canada. So obviously I'm an artist. I've been making art seriously for about a decade, and just a very small fraction of that time I've been able to like comfortably refer to myself as an artist without wincing. So I tried to pursue other things in post-secondary, and I would always sort of revert back to art. So I felt right making art, but also not always great about the fact that I was making art because I was flunking out of school as I was making exhibitions. So it's taken me a while to sort of sever that association of failing and committing to my purpose. Okay, so earlier on in my career, I was sort of very intensely focused on Black Canada and making work about a Black Canadian identity, or I guess the erasure of a Black Canadian identity, and sort of it felt necessary and obvious for me as a maker in Canada to delve into those topics. And so earlier work, like the sculptures I was doing, were almost exclusively composed of found objects, and they sort of act as these like emotional maps that would sort of mark the geographical distribution of different people or events and materials, obviously. So each object on the sculpture is like a coordinate. And most of the time on a good day, I can tell you by looking at the artworks, if I identify each piece, each object inside of a piece, I can tell you like where I was, who I was with, maybe what I was wearing, maybe what we did that day.
Tao, before you go on, we've started this wonderful slideshow with Woody's work, and I think you're talking about your work, it'd be nice if we can start from the other end. I don't know if there's a way to move it.
Maybe this is good. Maybe this is like part of our thing today.
It's like you're describing not what is up on this on the screen.
I'm not going to claim these beautiful sculptures. I didn't make these.
That said, if it's on an automatic loop, then maybe people will have to keep in mind what Tao says until
everything I'm
appear.
saying will make sense once my images come on the screen. Okay, so I was telling you about the objects and my sculptures. Okay, so part of the reason that I'm able to work in this way and have these mental maps within my sculptures is because I have a library of material in my studio, and it's taken years and years and years to build this wealth of materials. Some of them are from before the time that I was making art, because I was hoarding materials before I was making art. And so it's a vault. It's like an 8-foot tall locker that has, like a record of the dates and the locations and all of this stuff. So they're these very like valueless objects, if you will. And then some of those are pieces from friends or loved ones as well, so the origin or the date maybe is unknown of some of the pieces, and it calls into question for me, like what the true genesis of an artwork is, and questioning time and time as a medium. I got to speak with Marlene Bennett-Jones and Essie Bendolf-Petway, who are both quilt makers, and they're descended from a line of very prolific quilt makers in Gee's Bend, Alabama. And one of our unifying questions was just about time and how it's the most potent medium in an artwork, in all of our work. So, like, does the oldest piece of fabric in a quilt mark its true date of birth? Or if we call into question the time that it takes to scuff up the material, or for it to collect grass stains or blood stains or what have you, especially working with, like old field clothes, work clothes, things like this. If you count up all those hours, then how old is the artwork really? And what is the true age of the work really? So, yeah, especially for someone like me who is looking to materials for answers often and is attracted to materials for their distinctive flaws. These are things that I love to ponder. So my library keeps me constantly engaged in these thoughts, and constantly sort of tethered to and in communication with my artworks, because I live with their DNA relatives and I can hold and touch their DNA relatives. So being that I'm self-taught, and I hope we can talk a little bit about that term later on when more interesting things will come up in our conversation. And given the nature of like my material lexicon, it was pretty early on in developing my practice that I started to really familiarize myself with the makers of Gee's Bend, and seeing what I think is like truly masterful abstraction, and the transformation of materials, and also seeing the work of sculptors and painters of the Black American South, and artists like Thornton Dial and Richard Dial and Purvis Young, and especially Lonnie Holley, who's one of my favorite artists in the whole world. And I've given lectures on his work before, but last month, oh, there I am. Last month in DC, I was invited to do a talk for a show that I think is still on there. It's called To Create Artworks of the Black American South. And this was the first time that I actually got to speak to him, because he was in the audience, and talk about his impact to him, which I am forever grateful that I got to have that experience. So meeting him in 2018 was really impactful, and what came up for both of us in our conversations was how we could use art to analyze some of the telekinetic chords between communities of makers, not just artists, but also inventors and musicians and innovators of these sorts. And where do these common mechanisms for creating and inventing originate? And how does one become an expert at enacting transformation? So Black makers especially, I think, create cultural sounds and movements and artifacts. And with that, there's all of this reverberation that leads to even more transformation. And so I'm going to use music as an example, and I'm probably not going to stick the landing on this one. But so if you think of like how tiny the island of Jamaica is, and Jamaica creates reggae, and then reggae travels to South America and becomes reggaeton. Ton means big. And then overseas in the UK, the Windrush generation brings ska, which is the precursor to reggae, and then ska and reggae influence punk, which is just a beat off from reggae, in the late 70s. And then somewhere during this time in Kingston, Lee Scratch Perry uses echo and reverb to make dub, and then dub goes to the US, and young Black Americans in Detroit make techno. So I love sort of thinking about this type of movement, not just in visual arts, but also in music, which is one of my biggest inspirations. So pondering movement and also seeking, transforming and redistributing myself and the other makers that I know that seem to be naturally inclined to do these things, which of these parts of ourselves are learned or ingrained or intuitive or instinctual. And this is what Lonnie, Holly, and I felt that we needed to discuss, especially as it kind of related to our significant age gap and also our different geographical locations and different personal histories. And so I'm going to end this off by mentioning the other place where my thoughts travel to, which is the world of the imaginary, and specifically myth-making and world-building, which are actions that I think are directly related to enacting transformation. And so this is sort of where I live. And I think that in my reliance on the imaginary, I'm not really looking to be escapist, and I'm absolutely not aligning myself with any sort of Afrofuturist narrative. I really don't like that being assigned to my work. But I'm mostly sort of searching for loopholes in a worldly existence and some of its shortcomings, and also trying to sort of uncover pathways to spirituality. So I think it's totally natural, as a means of survival, that the imaginary kind of like steps in. Our imagination is able to take over where there's been some form of erasure, where there's a dark spot because of trauma. So imagining new spaces for new kinds of existence is sort of the natural route for me to engaging in spirituality, and the artworks are these portals or access points through which we can access each other. That's my spiel.
Wow. Thank you, Tao. That was really beautiful. And there's definitely a lot there that we've talked about previously that we will come back to. But before doing that, I wanted to give a chance. Actually, Woody, we're right back at your part of the slideshow.
Cool.
And it doesn't need, however you want to approach this question, it doesn't need to be, an overview. I mean, you said something when we were sitting down, which was how you hadn't really ever imagined being on a stage giving a talk like this. And I thought that in and of itself is an interesting jumping off point, sort of how you see your own journey as an artist.
I guess if I had to describe my art practice, sculpture practice, I think in simplest terms, I just oftentimes the starting point is looking at an everyday object and just imbuing it with some type of emotion and feeling. I feel like the way that I approach work, or at least the way that I hope it's being received, that there is a sense of some type of emotion going on. I think something that is important for me to communicate in my practice too is a sense of hope and optimism and joy, even though that some of the forms can be contorted and kind of floppy or leaning, or almost like gravity is weighing on them, even though there's this amount of struggle going on, there's still this optimistic outlook. And yeah, that's how I would describe my sculpture practice.
Then what I would love to do is, Tao mentioned this word self-taught, and I want to come back to that from Tao's perspective in a second, but in a way you guys have different paths, right? In the sense that in some sense, yours is more traditional, Woody, that there was a kind of traditional arts education. There was a kind of a gallery discovery, as it were, when you were still a student on the West Coast, right, at CCA. So I'm curious just a little bit about how you see education having played into your path and discovery of yourself as an artist. I think there's also a lot of students here, and I know students are always curious about whether or not they should be studying art or they should be making art. Not that there's necessarily a dichotomy there, but does that make sense? Yeah,
I think studying art is that was definitely a turning point in my life. I didn't go to an arts high school. I didn't go to an arts middle school. I actually got rejected from 2 arts high school. And then when I went into undergrad, I thought I was just going to study graphic design. But in undergrad, I was in this beautiful community of other students and people making. And I just realized I wasn't interested in art in terms of it having a quote unquote function, the way that graphic design would serve a function. But I was just interested in making. And in undergrad, I was exposed to just like contemporary art history and like, the kind of like canon of like historical art. And that really got solidified in my MFA education. I went to California College of Arts. California has like this rich ceramic history. I started, falling in love with ceramics in undergrad, and I was just like, oh, if I really want to pursue this like seriously, California is kind of the place that I needed to be. So
I always think it's interesting, but if you could almost like take us a little bit further into that moment when ceramics, it became clear to you that ceramics was the way that you were going to express or do what you wanted to do. Because in some cases, it takes artists a lot longer, right, to experiment and try different things before they find, I think, the medium that's most naturally suited to their form of expression. And that's a pretty early stage, right? I mean, undergraduate, you're 19, 20, something like that, right? So do you have any kind of like, almost like the emotional moments or?
yeah, there's actually like something that I tell people a lot because that question comes up. And, I kind of took a ceramics course on a whim. One of my roommates in undergrad was just like, you're making all these drawings. You should like see if you could sculpt them in 3D. So I took a ceramics course, and I remember the first time making like a little pinch pot, something in my body kind of like woke up. And like I had this like thing where I was just like, everything that I need to know about my past and future is in the material. And like every day that I'm able to go into the studio, that statement it's proving itself true.
Beautiful. Unlike the more traditional educational path, or what I would call the more legible, as it were, educational path with an MFA, et cetera, it's funny, Tao, your work is almost always, that word self-taught has sort of attached itself to you for better or for worse. I
people
can see you
love it.
rolling your eyes. But I know that it's always a much more complicated story. And of course, on some level, every artist is teaching themselves what it is they're
Yeah.
trying to find.
Of course. And I mean, you have to be self-taught when you're developing a studio practice. You can't have someone holding your hand in your studio. I'm fine with self-taught. I think it's outsider that I don't like. Sure. And I remember, this hasn't happened for years, but somebody who I was working with was really against the idea of me doing a show that had some of my favorite artists in it at the time because it was being framed as an outsider art show. And they were saying, do you really want to align yourself with that kind of language? And I do think that, the language that we develop around our work is allowed to change. And it is important, and that can't be understated. But I'm also just like, really? Like, we're in 2023 now? I mean, I don't really know how, like, I'm hoping that it's less and less relevant.
Yes.
I don't see myself, as an outsider. I'm fine with self-taught. But, I also tried. Like, I tried to go to school. It didn't work out.
Well, I know, I'm sure some people here know that there were 2 attempts at journalism, at school for journalism.
There was a failed attempt at journalism. I thought it would be a lot more investigative than it was. It was actually tweeting and like going on weird assignments and just, maybe right place, wrong time. I'm not sure. I haven't figured it out, and I try not to think too much about it. The second attempt was more just to placate my mom and show her that I was going somewhere during the day. But at that point, I had figured out how to dummy up a report card and stuff like that.
Got it.
So I didn't even try in that one. Like, it was just a waste of money. But
it was a second attempt at journalism.
it was a second attempt at going to school.
Right, okay,
this
got
was
it.
for a design foundations program, and I was learning things I'd already been taught in high school, and I was actually just bored.
And so how did it's just sort of like the natural question, how did your practice, as it started to develop alongside that probably, or on its own alongside that, and I mean, again, that word self-taught, I agree there's something weird about it, and I I don't think it's ever that helpful to classify how artists or categorize how artists discover what they want to make and how they want to make it. Sometimes it happens in a school situation, school setting, and sometimes it doesn't. Nonetheless, the story of how it happens is typically interesting. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about how you felt that developing alongside whatever the dead end or more dead end paths that were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was mostly the people I was surrounded with. And at that time, I had friends who were going to OCAD. And I actually had one of my friend's cards that you would use to get in and out of the building, and I would use her studio facility. And I began working as part of a collective. We would have guerrilla-style shows. We would just make shows. We did a couple shows outside, a couple in one of our apartments. I was working inside of my apartment for a long time, using it as a studio. And then I got my first actual studio, which was like 10 square feet, in a basement unit with 7 other women who were all, at the time, either attending OCAD or had recently graduated from OCAD. And so that was in a way useful for me because I was seeing other people attempting to work, and I had a lot of time to just work because I wasn't in school. And then I figured out that you could have studio visits. And that was like a foreign idea to me at the time. Somebody asked me if they could do a studio visit, and I thought, what? What do you mean? And I started to learn that, you can also do visits with other artists. And you can bring food, and it can be like a picnic, and you can just talk about art. So, these are things that artists should do regardless of whether or not they have gotten a degree. This is necessary, I think, for thriving.
Yeah, I think about that question for younger artists about how a community is formed and how you kind of develop that or nurture that, really. And I was thinking about, Woody, how that transition from the California College of Arts basically directly into the gallery system, right, more or less, how that worked for you in terms of maintaining or even creating a community with or around the gallery that you started showing with, Great San Francisco Gallery, or with the students that you were studying with? Like, how did that kind of work out?
I feel like, we just shape the kind of like existence that we want. And I feel like, I don't necessarily only have art friends. Like some of my best friends in the Bay are musicians, photographers. But it's just like, I feel like you could learn from like anybody if you're like open and receptive to it. So I think like, community is just like in having conversation, but there is like this like spirit when you're around like other creative people that is just like, it's like intoxicating. It's like magnetic. And, whether you're like a chef or like, I don't know, there's just so many things to learn from a lot of different people. So I think, yeah, I'm just like very open, and I think I'm fairly approachable and friendly, and it's like easy to have a conversation. So it doesn't even matter. I feel like some of my best friends in the Bay like aren't even artists. Like one of them works in tech, the other one is a social worker, and that's my community. I have other friends like who run gallery space, and I have other friends who are like painters and whatnot. But I feel like community is just in communion and friendship and being around people who like care for you. So,
And the people who are not in art, do you find that you're able to have those kinds of creative conversations about your practice? Yes.
Yeah, because they offer something that is just like very like, just like there's not that like it's just very to the point. Like they just tell you how they feel or how they're having an emotional reaction to something. I feel like, a lot of times I love like just showing my mom or my dad or my sister something, and if they like it, they like it. If they don't, they let me know. It's it's very honest and very straightforward. And there's not like this like rumbling of like trying to drop these like historical contexts. It's just like,
so annoying.
Yeah. It's like, how is this thing functioning? Like, do I like it? Do I not like it? So I feel like in that sense, like there's something to learn. I feel like if anything too, like little kids are like kind of really amazing. You know, when I was in graduate school, I taught like at various elementary schools in the Bay, and I would like just come up with projects or do artist talks, and like some of the like reactions that they would give towards the art, I was just like, yo, I'm taking that back with me to the studio. So I feel like community is like very like flexible, and it's just being amongst people and just sharing information and knowledge.
Yeah, there's a great sculptor, Fred Sandback, works in yarn and other materials, and he was much more interested in the way kindergartners responded to the work than the way art historical PhDs
There's
respond.
no BS with a kindergartner, like, or a first grader. They're straight to the point.
They see things that you don't see also, like, honestly, because they are smaller than you. Like,
Yeah.
they're seeing things from a different perspective. I did mean that in more of, like, a spiritual sense as well, but, like,
Yeah,
the
it
perspective
works
is
both
actually
ways.
different.
And Tao, how has community kind of helped form you, or you formed the community that you wanted to be part of, or the conversation you wanted to be part of? If that's something that you think about?
Yeah, something I'm really glad that I did in my first studio that I ever had was anytime I had a visitor, which was frequently because I don't know, I had people stopping by all of the time, and I was usually there. I had like a wall where I would write down names, and then I would try to do a bit of research to see if I thought the work was interesting, if it was somebody who was still alive, and maybe I could try and find them, or maybe I could see their studio, or if they had a show on somewhere in a city nearby, could I go and try to see the show? So New York was very accessible, obviously, being that I was in Toronto. And I would just take the bus as frequently as I could, and it was not long before I actually had more of a community in New York City than I did in Toronto in terms of, you know, art community, I guess. And also there's just a different sort of a pulse there. I feel like I could absorb more in one afternoon in New York than I might all year in Toronto. I'm not saying that in a negative way, it's just the truth.
Sounds really positive, actually.
It's just the truth. You know, so yeah, I have made an effort to build a community of people whose thoughts I want to hear and be influenced by. And I feel like that's where we grow and how we sort of generate and regenerate is actually through our peers. It's how I've gotten most of my opportunities is by being friends with people and seeing and speaking to people and being open and honest and raw in these conversations with other artists. So I'm very grateful for that. But then at the same time, I'm also like extremely hermetic when I'm working. Like I live a very closed off life in my studio when I'm making a show.
I think that's something that many people here would be curious about, which is just sort of your studio practices, each of you, how you structure your time in the studio, how that works. And maybe, Woody, you can talk a little bit about how you kind of break up your time, how you find ways to be creative, when that happens, how often you're in the studio, and you know how you manage your own expectations of yourself, which I think is one of the hardest things as an artist.
Yeah, that's like, you know, the managing your own expectations, that's always like a back and forth. And I feel like, you know, for me, it's just like practicing grace and being generous and giving my body what it needs when I need it. I'm a big fan of rest. So I go to sleep at a reasonable hour, like, and I almost can't go into the studio without like doing some type of like exercise or workout prior to. I feel like going on a run or a bike ride or going on a quick little hike with my dog kind of gets my mind set up to go in the studio. I feel like, you know, throughout the course of the year, I'm like also a believer of consistency. So it's like I try and be as consistent as possible, but I'm also a believer of space. And I think like there's a lot of like growth that happens when you have space. So I feel like a normal like work week, if we want to get like routine, you know, I'm in the studio Monday through Friday. I like my weekends off. Just to do
Fair
other,
enough.
yeah, to
Everybody
do other
else does
things.
too, yeah.
But I feel like taking the weekends off like gives me the freshness that I need to be present and to like give the work what it needs. So yeah, I think like over the course of just like getting ready for exhibitions and whatnot, things are a little bit more extreme. I feel like there are definitely periods where I'm like in the studio 7 days a week for like a month or two at a time, but you know, after those stretches, there's always like a reprieve or like a moment of like fresh air and like definitely necessary to like have a little time off or maybe a lot of time off before going back into making work. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like making art and having a studio practice is like a responsibility, and like the things that you care about, like how do you nurture it? And sometimes you hover, and sometimes you just like need a little bit more space.
How about you, Tao?
How do I structure my studio practice?
Well, I know we've talked in the past that you, I think, can be less boundaried with yourself sometimes in terms of how time gets spent in the studio. Like, you'll work late, and
Yeah.
it's interesting to hear different ways of being in that
Yeah.
space.
I still haven't really got it down. I haven't totally figured it out. But I think that's also okay. And I think it's okay to flip back and forth depending on what's going on with how I manage my time. The one thing I know for sure is that, you know, what Woody just said about being consistent. Having the kind of studio practice that I want to have doesn't work unless I am there for a certain amount of time for a certain number of days per week. I work with a team. I'm rarely by myself in the studio, and there are parts of that that are really wonderful, but there are also parts of it that can be challenging and really create a yearning in me to have that alone time, and I don't have a separate space in this moment. So I will go in on the weekends and try to be alone there, or I will stay later at night to try to be alone there outside of the like core hours of the studio. The rest thing is something I'm still figuring out. I know that it's important, but I am sort of in my wellness bag right now. I'm very into fitness and crystals, and it's embarrassing. I'm rapidly like becoming a crystal person, and it's been thrust upon me. It's not something that I chose for myself. Resting, taking vacation. I did take some time off after a show that I opened in October in New York, and it wasn't by choice, actually. I was sort of forced by life to take time, and I don't think it was enough time. I think that I have to take more, but I am still working on getting to a place where I'm not being forced to take time off work.
I want to ask how influence happens for you. Like, in what ways do you find yourself being porous? I mean, the thing I'm most interested in with artists is often the way other media influence the way they think. So reading is, I mean, that's because that's such a big way of how I'm influenced. So I think I often sometimes project that. So I was going to ask about the books that you read, and then I thought, well, you actually just shared something that recently entered your life and clearly has some meaning for you, even if you're, you know, laughing at it in some way. And I'm curious if you can talk about that process, you know?
Yeah, I can. Music is a huge thing for me. I'm a big music person. I can't exist or work without music. I have friends that don't listen to anything in their studio or listen to audiobooks. I don't understand it. I don't get it. I have friends that don't even like music. Just don't like it. Recently, though, there's been like a little bit of a reckoning with my studio and a bit of a rough patch in our relationship, and it feels good to talk about this out loud, but having difficulty with things that really make me feel emotional, and I can't be in my work and not be emotional. I'm looking for other tasks all day long that are gonna remove me a little bit from the emotional side of things. I'm just starting to feel comfortable listening to certain kinds of music again that aren't just fast-paced and energetic, like techno, which I love techno. The crystals actually make a lot of sense, and I've avoided crystals for a long time because I don't want to be a crystal person, and I feel like everyone wants me to be a crystal person. I'm even like wearing this like crystal person like hippie skirt, and like it totally makes sense for who I am and what I do and the way that I think. But the reason why it's so awesome for me right now is because it opens up this whole new world that even if it's not real, you get to believe in it. And you get to believe that holding this stone in your hand is going to open up your throat chakra and make you speak more clearly and help you pour your heart out. Or, you know, Dalmatian stone is going to help you remember to have fun. Like, those are things that I need right now. And they came to me, and I had several people bring me crystals or give me crystals, and then I started identifying them all around my space. I actually have tons of them because I collect things. So duh, like I was finding crystals in my piles of rocks. I have so many like bins of rocks and things like that. And finding things and looking them up, and I have an app, I have a tracker, I have like a crystal identifier, I have all this stuff now, because when I get into something, I really get into it. I don't even know if I just answered your question at
you
all.
absolutely. I think it was really, you completely answered it. And I would love, I mean, not the same question really, Woody, but just the question of how things enter your consciousness, I think is so important for artists. You know, like how you bring new information in that can then make its way into the work.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were like talking about a little bit earlier with like community and like peers and friends. I feel like I love when my friends like either put me onto new music or books. I feel like, you know, all of the books that I've read recently or have had a huge like affinity on like just like my personal well-being, like have come from my friends. Like I mentioned, my one friend who's a social worker, he gave me this book of Water and Spirit by Malidoma Patrice Somi, and I've been in his world for like the past 2 years. Then I have another musician friend who gave me this book, As Serious as Your Life. It's like a book about free jazz and just learning about like the type of like ethos and the type of like practice and like mindset that, you know, these musicians had with like developing like, you know, this like avant-garde like experimental music. So I think like, you know, a lot of the influences or the way that things enter me come from the people around me and community. Like Tal mentioned, I'm a huge fan of music, and I feel like music really is like just non-verbal communication. So it helps me tap into like an emotional space, and I'm able to then transfer that energy into trying to like into a sculpture or a painting, or you know, it helps me to kind of like identify the things that I'm trying to communicate. But yeah, I think I just think like community and peers and family and like relationships like do so much in terms of like influencing all of us.
Now I have to ask Tao, since Woody brought the books up, now I want to ask about some of the writers you've mentioned in things that I've read or know about you, whether that's someone like Delaney, great science fiction writer, Ursula K. Le Guin, whom you've mentioned, Soyinka, who I think gets referenced alongside your work quite a bit in the academic writing. You know, to what extent are you regularly reading or thinking about text? Or I'm thinking about, there's a great catalog essay for a book that is coming out for Tao's recent New York show at 52 Walker, which talks a lot about the idea of the theater. Hopefully you've already read a draft of it. Okay, good.
I forgot that there was a book happening.
But, you know, talks about the theater as a reference point, and I was just curious how much of that is present to you as you're thinking about your own work.
Yeah, so I do love sci-fi. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole during the production of the show, 52 Walker. And it started out in sci-fi, but then it quickly kind of diverged to religious texts and theater, and I started thinking through some of the connections in some of these texts and how they related to one another. There's a writer, Wande Abimbola, who is a Nigerian scholar, and he has a book called Ifa Will Mend Our Broken World, which is all about the Yoruba structure of religion and Yoruba metaphysical thought. And I had never really delved into some of these ideas, and it kind of lends itself really, really well to working within the imaginary, because it's impossible to sort of pick apart some of these religious ideas and practices without thinking about the imaginary world. There's another book that I love, Peter Lamborn Wilson. It's called Angels, and it's about the studies of angels throughout different cultures and religions, and how they appear and reappear, and how they kind of appear the same in different places. And I love thinking about the fact that it could have traveled naturally, in a very natural way, by word of mouth. These ideas, cross cultural borders. But I also do love the idea that two people on different sides of the world were seeing the same angel. And I don't know, I'm very I'm a believer. I love to believe. And I'm curious about religious thought. I'm not a religious person myself, I'm spiritual. But I do find these sort of texts very inspiring.
That's beautiful, and this is the moment in the talk where I feel like I really did prepare, because I know that you, Woody, have mentioned in passing a book on Yoruba practice as well, Vigilant Things, which you've talked about being an influence on you, and I was reminded of that as Tao was talking about Yoruba, which I know is important to the last show, and even more than that. And Woody, maybe...
Yeah, I feel like learning about Yoruba religion and reading texts about Yoruba religion and other African religion is a point of access to our ancestors outside of this narrative that's just strictly colonial. It's just it's about something entirely different. It's accepting the supernatural. It's about being in nature, being present. I've just learned so much that almost affirms something internal by kind of investigating and researching Yoruba practices. Right now I'm reading a book, slowly making my way through it, by the artist Maya Deren, that my partner put me on to, called Divine Horsemen, and it's about voodoo practices in religion, but in Haiti. But they talk about all of the different African religions that are kind of commingling and in conversation with each other, and just
Orishas also exist in both places.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Haitian voodoo, and also Mayal, and also I don't know. I'm probably not gonna word this properly. Sorry, I'm blanking right now. The fact that ghostliness, or I guess being in communication with spirits, is innately dark, is very much a colonial sort of leftover that I think has stained a lot of our relationships with the continent. And a lot of these religious cultural practices that were pretty much decimated and vilified, and still are. And also,
it takes away for me, I'm realizing, the reason, or not a reason, but a possibility why these practices were decimated, is because that's where
they were community based.
Yeah,
they were community based, and it's almost in direct opposition to Christianity. Mm-hmm. And in Yoruba, it's if the people were not, if without people, God would not be, right? And it's the opposite in Christianity. It's without God, there are no people. And I think that's really interesting. And it's a community-based identity as opposed to, like the singular personal identity.
It's funny because one of the things I was thinking about in the lead up to this, and we're talking about now naturally, is the things that bring your work together or that put it in conversation. And there seems to be this deep thread, you could call it spirituality, but almost wanting to imbue objects with a certain kind of life force. I mean, you described it as wanting the objects to kind of express what they might feel. And that's sort of like the quote that Lillian started with.
Yeah, but it's just like we live in connection to our environment. It's just like there's not a hierarchy. I feel like that's another thing I learned by like reading and like kind of like going down the rabbit hole of like Yoruba. It's just like we are in existence with nature. Nature is not this thing that we could just pillage and use. And like I feel like our environment kind of exists in a very similar way. Like, an analogy that always comes to mind is just like when I'm sick, my room feels sick. So I have to like clean my sheets and kind of like cleanse that space to kind of like, rid itself of that kind of like energy. And it's just like, to me, like there's this symbiotic relationship between our bodies and the things in our space. They literally take on our characteristics. So if I own this chair for 20 years, it would be completely cushioned to my body, So I feel like, I think like humans have this way of like looking at things like, or like the Western world's like, we dominate everything, but it's just like, no, we live in collaboration with the world around us.
I think that I do project parts of myself onto my work, but I'm also a firm believer in the information that is attached to objects, the emotional information. And if you were like clearing out the home of a loved one or something, and you would most certainly feel things in touching their belongings, smelling them, seeing them, on those things. For me, it doesn't feel so different if I'm handling objects that I don't know the origin of, or objects that didn't belong to me. I feel like my hands are sponges, and I feel like with that, I am overly sensitive in several ways, but I feel things very intensely in a way that almost feels loud. And it's a good thing that I've locked up my collection of objects because it feels better, those things being sealed. And, David Hammons talked about, collecting hair at barbershops in the 70s and making artwork out of people's hair and how it like almost drove him mad. And Betty Saar has similar stories about, handling her own work. And I do think that energy transfers, and certainly transfers maybe stronger onto different materials, like natural materials, woods, metals, stones, crystals, hair. But I think that it makes things come alive, it makes things feel alive, and it might be different if I also didn't believe in ghosts, but I do kind of believe in ghosts, and ghost for me is kind of unanimous with spirit and ancestor. So I see things come alive because I want to see things come alive, and I want to feel things most of the time. But that's what my art does for me, I don't think that that's what my art does for everybody, but that's what it does for me.
Thank you for that, Tao. There's so many other things I would want to ask about, but we are also at a point where we want to open it up to some other people. But before we do that, I just want to give a round of applause to Tao and Woody for
There's a mic on the left aisle and on the right aisle with Charlotte over there, so you can maybe line up just behind me here and come and ask your questions.
I thought you were first. Okay. Thanks for the talk. It's really illuminating. I have a practical question that is about the intersection of, I guess, success in a traditional sense, how it intersects with work ethic, how you spoke about your practice being really regimented to a degree. And you also spoke about trying with the crystals, maybe help. And you also talked about how you did a lot of studio visits with different artists, like when you discovered that that was possible. So I'm really curious about the intersection of network or community and work ethic, and how that, what effect it has on an artist's career and on their quote-unquote big break or something, if you believe in something like that. It's a question for the panel in general, not just for you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's been my experience that nothing outweighs the importance of being in your studio and just working constantly, because that's the most important thing. And it truly doesn't matter who you meet or who you're sat next to at a dinner or how many gallery openings you go to. If you're not making outstanding work or striving to make outstanding work that you think is important, it's not really going to matter all that much. I think being firmly rooted in what you're doing and developing that to its highest potential, committing to that all of the time is the most important thing. And I've never been a schmoozer. I can't do it. I'm not equipped to do it. I'm very awkward. I haven't felt like I need to, and I'm ashamed of the fact that I don't go out enough. I don't see enough for the fact that I live in New York City, and partially the reason why I think most of us would want to live in New York City. But yeah, studio is most important.
Studio.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much. It was such a great conversation. I learned a lot from both of you. One thing that I wanted to ask was, Tao, you talked about the library of objects that you have in your studio. And I was wondering, Woody, if you have a relationship with your own archive, or if you also have a relationship with the term library with your own object, and if, Tao, you wanted to talk a little bit more about that too while I was on that question.
Yeah, I don't think I have a library of like objects in the sense that, I'm perceiving that you might have in terms of like collecting things, but there are definitely like different like objects that are like reoccurring motifs that come up a lot in my work. And I feel like, there are a couple of objects that feel like they just have a lot of openness. They just have a lot of openness. So it's just like, like the faucet, like, somebody just like look at it as a faucet, but like, I kind of like look at it as like becoming cleansed. And then that kind of gets me into like that like spiritual space of just like, baptism or like voyage and passage. But like, that is all channeled from like a simple like faucet. So yeah, in that sense, there is like a little bit of a library of things that I like to use and come back to.
Yeah, I can add a little bit. I wouldn't call it a library until very recently. Before it was just bins of stuff and many, many bins of stuff. I've become very obsessed lately with organizing and creating organizational tasks for myself. And it's been a real joy getting to revisit all of the objects in the process of putting them away and archiving them. And also, I just have really felt the need to know that things are there and know how much of each thing I have, and that it's in a place, and I know exactly where it is. So yeah.
We have a question here.
Yeah, my question is, were there moments in the process of becoming an artist where any of you thought, like, this is not worth it? I'm like this close to quitting.
For me, definitely not. I feel like for me, it would, regardless of like visibility or not, I feel like, I remember like working like just like random jobs, like doing like a TaskRabbit or like pulling weeds and working at a sandwich shop. And I would be doing all of this stuff and it's just like, oh, I want to go home and make a drawing because that's what my space is like set up to do. I don't think like, I didn't even know it was possible to like have a quote unquote career as an artist until like, I don't know, like undergrad. I was like, oh, you could do this. But I feel like for me, like being an artist wasn't like a decision per se, but it was just like a way of like existing. Like I feel like, I remember drawing it in elementary school because I was getting bullied, but that was a way for me to express like my internal world. So I feel like that's just a way for me to communicate and get like whatever energy is like mustering up inside of me out. So I feel like regardless of what would be happening, like I feel like I would be not necessarily an artist, but I would be making stuff. Yeah, that's just like my perspective on it.
I agree with that. I think it depends what you want, and I've gone back and forth a few times about what kind of art career I want. I know that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and that's really, really valuable. It's also valuable to know what you don't want to do, but art is what I want to do, and I think it's not the right path for somebody who wants, an abundance of financial wealth or fame or accolades or all of these things. I think it's really something you have to do if you feel just the unavoidable conviction to do. But do I think about not doing it all the time? I think that everybody should feel that way in their job sometimes. And I joke all the time about quitting art to be a caterer because I love catering. My galleries hate it when I bring that up. It's like a sick joke for them. It's not a joke to me. I also feel like I could have been a DJ. I think that if my dad wasn't trying to force it on me so hard because he owned a bar and he would MC at his bar, I could have ended up doing that. I just didn't like it because of how it was thrust on me. But I think I would always go back to art.
While we're on the topic of moments, you guys both mentioned moments in the beginning of the talk. I'm curious if there's specific moments in the creation of certain works that you can, examples that you could bring up. Like for instance, maybe for the National Gallery piece, or maybe on transitioning to painting, or I don't know if you're transitioning to painting, but if you're starting in painting Woody. So just, yeah, for each.
Moments? Like,
Yeah, so like a moment of real life, like the moment when that piece, had resolved itself in your mind.
Sometimes I feel like absolute clarity about an artwork from start to finish. And sometimes I don't. It's more rare that I don't. But, the thing that happens most frequently for me, if I'm working on a figure, there's a part of making it that I have to work on the head, and I have to make the face details, and I actually will see it looking back at me, and it becomes human on a level to me, and I start to feel intimacy and feelings for it that I don't feel for a random object. That's something that is very regular for me. And then I also, with the National Gallery piece, that was something that I made in the height of the pandemic, and that artwork saved my life. Like I got up every day in the depth of my depression to go and be with that work because I felt so held by it. It was the first time I used orange or pink. So those are my moments.
Yeah, I feel like, there's some, like Tao, there are some moments where it's just like a piece kind of like has like this extreme clarity. I feel like that's kind of rare for me. I feel like a lot of times I'm kind of like rummaging in the dark trying to excavate something, especially with like ceramics. Like there's just a lot of variables with, is this thing gonna survive in the kiln? Like sometimes I glaze stuff and I'm like, oh, like this thing is like green and I totally wanted it to be like blue or like orange. So I feel like I've just gotten comfortable with having a more like organic relationship with making, and I feel like it's definitely like a communication, especially like working with like the material of like ceramics and clay, like, and just how it interacts with the environment. Like if there's a lot more humidity in the air or a lot more moisture in the air, then it takes a long time for the clay to like solidify itself. So if I go in with one plan and it's just like kind of not like setting up, or it starts like drooping away, I'll just like start to follow that form. So I think that's also like, I'm a Gemini, so I constantly vacillate between going back and forth. So yeah.
Come on up.
I'm just going to stay seated. I really appreciate your candor and your humor, both of you. I think it was just great. Well, all three of you, but yeah, it was really nice to listen to you talk. And I wanted to ask about how you feel when writers write about your work, because there are a lot of things you talked about that kind of run in parallel to your work, like your love of music, your love of writing. But when a writer sort of theorizes about your work, does it make you feel uncomfortable sometimes, or does it make you feel excited? I'm always really curious about that, because the relationship to people's work can be so personal that when somebody kind of specifically writes in a way about it, it can sometimes really open certain doors, but it can also feel very specific to the writer. So yeah, just wanted your thoughts on that.
I really like it, unless it's just reductive or not thoughtful. I really like it, depending on the background of the writer as well, especially if they're not coming from a specifically visual arts background. That's my favorite. I enjoy hearing other people's takeaways and perspectives from what they're experiencing. I think that it would be weird if I only wanted people to see things my way. Really, I don't. And really, yeah, people have taught me things about my own work. And you don't have to love everything that everyone writes or, be on board with it all the time. But I do think it's really important. Yeah,
I feel very similarly. Like most of the time I appreciate it, even if I don't necessarily appreciate it. But I feel like more times than often, there are times where I'm like reading something about my work. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yo, yeah. It's like
writers.
illuminating to
it's
me.
Their job.
Yeah. I'm just like, because you're in the studio, you're just making this thing. And I feel like for me, it's like more of an emotional feeling thing. And it's just like, like the way that writers are able to bring in like connections, I'm like, oh, it's illuminating and like refreshing. So for the most part, like, I really enjoy reading and hearing, thoughts and perceptions about like not only my work, but of like other work in general, because it's just like, I feel like language, I'm not a writer for a reason. So, it's just very illuminating and generous. And just like some people are just very like beautiful with the way that they're able to describe things and piece things together.
Hi, thank you so much for everything. I'm an artist myself, so I have a question. I was wondering, how was your relationship with your team and your studio assistants? Because I'm thinking for emerging artists and that their career is going well or better. It's always a thought that we have, and to think about, do we need an assistant? And I'm wondering, because my mom is my assistant / collaborator, I don't know if you had this same thing for you, where you had your family supporting you and helping you and literally being your assistant / collaborators, and how did it first came in? How did your first collaborators came in, and how did it work?
My family didn't respect my art until it was in the Toronto Star, which is the newspaper in Toronto. It was a big commitment and a big leap of faith the first time I ever hired an assistant. It was also a huge sacrifice because I really could not afford it. I think that you won't know until you try, if you can, because it's meant to expand your capabilities. It's meant to be an investment in you and your practice, and you share your skills with someone else, and then they can be extra hands for you, and you can have more time to make your ideas. And hopefully you can, make your world bigger and better with that. But it is a big commitment, and it's also kind of daunting. I was really holding on to control over all of the minutia of making my work. And I feel so good that I've been able to let go of some of that, because it really helps me lend myself to greater, more important curiosities. So, I think that you have to take risks depending on what you want to do, where you want to be. And some of it, most of the time for most artists, I think, is financial risk for sure. But you're also allowed to change your mind about the kind of practice that you want to have. I can see myself scaling back or not. I'm not really sure, but it's totally fine to change how you make and where you make from as well.
Yeah, I feel like, for me personally, I just realized all the things that I wanted to do, I couldn't do on my own. So, you just have to recruit help. It's a little challenging. It is a huge, at least initially, a huge risk financially is I don't know if I could afford this, but I need the help. So it's just kind of managing in a certain way. And I feel another thing too is just that I'm still learning how to be effective with trying to do is just when you have somebody else helping you with your work, there's this type of expectation when somebody shows up to work, and to have some clear guidance and in terms of almost being a leader, and just how do you cultivate the type of energy and support system for you to achieve the things that you want to do, but the person or the people coming in to help your studio, hopefully it's how can that be an equal exchange? How can it be a learning opportunity? What are the goals of the people coming into your studio? How can you help them get to where they want to be, and vice versa? So I feel now I'm really thinking about it as just okay, I need this help, and it's critical for what I'm trying to achieve in my artwork, but it's just I don't want that to get drown out, just the personal relationship with it, because I've been a studio assistant as well, and that's how I've learned. And I've had mixed situations with being a studio assistant. I've worked for people that was amazing, and I've worked for people where I'm just I got to get the hell out of here. So it's a very complicated case by case situation, but I feel at least right now I'm just trying to be as open and as generous and as communicative as I can be, so the environment feels healthy, because their energy is also going into your work. So it's how do you create just a space that feels supportive and kind and good. So yeah, I feel the studio team and help and all that, I wish there was more transparency about just how do you structure a studio.
Oh my God, it's taken so long for me to get to a point where to where I'm at now, where things run so seamlessly, and I have a structure that really works for me, and I don't have to be there every single day either. And it's an ecosystem. It really is. Like, we all depend on each other, and compatibility is so important. Values are so important. I'm very upfront about that, and there's a reason why it works out. And I love the people that I work with. Like, I love going to work and seeing my people.
If we don't have any more questions, oh, you have a question? Did you want to come up? Okay.
I was just curious about the pressure you might feel being as successful as you are at such a young age. Does that change anything for you? Or, I mean, you don't know. That's where you started.
Yeah. Again, I think you're allowed to constantly, change the ways in which you work and want to work. And yeah, to what we were saying earlier, Lillian, I think that if the pressure is there, and if people want to live with your work, want to see your work, hopefully you're in a place where you are able to manage those demands and expectations in a way that feels comfortable for you. And hopefully you have galleries that will support you, even if you're not able to, generate the amount of work that they wish that you would or hope that you would. Because they need you, right? Like, you don't just need them, like, they need you as well. You're the one making the artwork. And you can't make the artwork if you're not healthy and stable. So that's the most important thing all the time.
Yeah, I have to second the healthy and stable part. I feel like it's a constant, checking in with yourself. Because, if you're not healthy and stable, then you're not showing up, to give the work what it needs. So it's just for me, it always comes back down to the work. And, somebody was, talking about, success and work. That was a question earlier. And it's just really, what does the work need? How can you support the work? How can you be in service to the work? Because I feel sometimes when you're under pressure and stressed out and you have all this chaotic energy, I mean, you could potentially make something beautiful, but the artwork holds that energy. And it's just
not
what's
sustainable.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, you might make some bangers here and there, but it's not the burnout is real. Exhaustion is real. Feeling physically ill is real. Like getting sick back to back to back. It's just you're not getting the rest that you need. So I feel the pressure thing is a negotiation, and it's just I don't want to show up to work and feel pressure. I want to show up to work and feel granted, it's not a completely idyllic state, but it's just give the work the time that it needs. It's think about making food. If you make food in a rush, and you're trying to eat it, it's not gonna be all that good. So it's just setting up boundaries, and I feel one thing that I'm learning just in general is just if I'm feeling something going on in my chest, how do I communicate that outward? Because most of the time when you communicate it, the people around you are there to help you. So, and most of the time people are helpful. So, yeah.
This is the first year that I've really stood firmly and felt good saying no to people. I could say no before, but I didn't necessarily feel good in it, and I'm sad that it took, a bereavement period for me to feel like I was able or afforded to get some rest and back out of things. But I think that that's a big milestone for me, the fact that that feels good.
Tao, Woody, Lucas, thank you so much. That was so generous.
I think there's one more question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
One more question?
Go
I
ahead.
just saw his face. I was like, oh no.
Crazy. Thank you so much. I want to hear you guys more about just intention. Because one way to create would be from what do I want to express, right? Self-expression was a big thing. But another way to create as well would be what would be the message that I want to convey to my audience. And so do you identify more with, so when you create, the intention that you set on your art is, hey, this is what I want to say, this is what I want to, the feelings that I have in my heart that I want to get out? Or do you start more from, hey, this is a message. This is the feelings that I want my audience to feel and create from there?
I think thinking about the audience is dangerous to a degree. That's my personal thoughts, but that's also based on my personal experience and my relationship to art making. But I don't try and, I don't know, maybe is that selfish to say that I'm not making for my audience specifically? I also don't know who my audience is all of the time. Like, I don't want to assume about my audience or what they want or don't want or can handle or can't handle. But that's just my experience.
Yeah, I think it's different, you know, for the context of the work and the context of like the type of artist that you want to be. I feel like for me, like, I do think about like the emotional exchange that's happening when people come to like receive the work. I don't know if it's necessarily like thinking about the audience, but I think it's like thinking about like, what is it that I'm trying to communicate? So in that sense, like, I feel like, you know, having an intention is at least for me, it's just like most of the time when I make a work, I'm just like, that's like the thesis statement. It's just like, how do I want this thing to feel, right? And then it's just like, that could be a range of like emotions and like spectrum. But I do think that like once the work leaves the studio, then it becomes a collaboration because people bring their own energy into it. And like, you can't necessarily like control how the audience is going to react to the work, but I feel like there are a lot of like formal like cues in terms of like making like work and the way that it's perceived, where, you know, you could maybe try and like guide, you know, or like it's just like, hey, like this is kind of how I want you to feel. It's all right if you don't, but this is what the energy of the work is. So I think it just depends. Yeah, it just depends, and I don't think it needs to be fixed at all. Sometimes you just want to make some stuff because I just want to make this thing because I really want to make it. Or, you know,
That's
you want to...
really important, too.
Yeah.
Don't always have to approach it seriously.
Yeah.
Like, you're allowed to make junky, stupid shit. I love making weird, stupid little doodles, comics, like, almost, in my studio. Or, like, jewelry, or, I don't know. Like, you don't always have to make from this intense, emotional place. Like, you know.
I think some of the... At least, yeah, some of the things that almost feel like a bad idea, those are the things I'm compelled to make the most.
Yeah, you have to like get those bad thoughts out. Let the intrusive thoughts win.
Thank you.